Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today we're doing part 3 of a worldview-oriented series with my friend Josh Kline. We're talking about cultural forces, ideas, and worldview structures that are deeply influencing Western society and, of course, can be and are a threat to the church. Josh, welcome back.
Good to be here.
It's been a phenomenal and dynamic conversation. We want to invite people to go back and watch the first 2 episodes if they haven't been able to catch them, because we're jumping right in the middle of it. Right. Boom. Okay, so we've been talking about Marxism. We've mentioned a couple of times the concern that people might tune us out because, Marxism, that's an old idea, discredited Soviet Union, that kind of stuff. I think we've shown that that's not the case. And now we're going to explore how Marxism has morphed. So the basic structures are there, but there's been a morphing that's gone on historically with that. This is really important for people to understand. So let's begin with a key figure in that, Antonio Gramsci. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, Gramsci is, his whole thing was, the Marxists thought, remember, Karl Marx was primarily thinking in economic terms. So he thought that this was something, the Marxist revolution was something that was unavoidably going to happen, that eventually capitalism would lead into this worldwide Marxist revolution. But that didn't happen. It happened in the Soviet Union, but it didn't happen across the world. So you had some kind of disgruntled Marxists who were confused, like, why didn't this happen? And Gramsci was the guy who said, well, wait, we got this wrong. It's not just economic. We need to look at this from a cultural perspective. And so his focus was on changing the culture. And so what he said is that you need to attack what he called the hegemony. And he defines the hegemony as the cultural, moral, and ideological leadership over allied and subordinate groups. And so if you attack the hegemony, then that's how you're going. And remember, Marxism is primarily a dialectic. So it's the one group against the other group. There's the bourgeoisie, the proletariat.
But there's conflict.
Right, but that's economic. So how can you divide up society in a cultural way to form that dialectic that's going to precipitate the change that the Marxists want? And so that's where Gramsci really comes into play here. It's a different strategy to achieve the same goal.
So let's talk about what that looks like. Men and women, black and white, rich and poor, different classes. I mean, right. Everything. Is that how he applied to Marxism? Let's explore that a little further.
Yeah, Gramsci saw that in places like the United States, there were cultural institutions that acted like bulwarks against Marxism, like the church, like the family, like even the educational system, the way that it was there to perpetuate the society. You know, you taught American history and everybody was patriotic, and you're just producing more of the same.
Right,
so
right.
How do you?
He wanted to stop that production.
How do you fight against that? So part of what he said was that you had to infiltrate these institutions, sort of like a virus, right? You get in there and you take over a section of that, and then from that section, then you launch attacks. You don't want to kill the host, right? But you attack from within until eventually, slowly, he actually talked about this as if it was like a trench warfare. You don't have a direct frontal attack. You slowly make inroads and inroads and inroads. And he actually said that once all these conditions are in place, once you make all these inroads and kind of start to change the way that people think about these things, a new collective will, ideological control over institutions of civil society, revolutionaries and strategic positions in the state. Once you achieve that, then the time would be right for the conclusive war of movement. And so essentially you work from within the system, and you get, like we said, you use terminology that sounds innocuous and that people think, well, yeah, I support that. That sounds like a worthwhile goal. But that's really not where your goal is. You know, You're not really looking to promote equality among people. You're using this to get in and then ultimately bring the system down. And so that's why Gramsci, I think, is so influential and important in this movement, because he realized there needs to be a strategy shift here. And that's why I think this is so slippery to grasp on this, right?
Yeah.
Because you know, you're stuck in this thought of the Cold War and like communism is this and we're not that. But Gramsci's approach was so different that he said you get into these institutions and you change them. Primarily, for example, think about the educational institution. They got into the educational colleges, and then you from there you train the people who are going to be teaching. And so you want to change the system so you're not perpetuating the system, but you're actually generating a whole new thought process, like we talked about. You can change the history from within the schools. You want to tear the churches down, so you want to get inside the churches, and you want to work from within. So that, and interestingly, there was a paper that was written that had to do with feminist studies, but it's the same idea. That they said if you get 4% of an institution to agree with this, and you get another 4% to be sympathetic, then all you need is a precipitating event, and then those people say, like, this is not acceptable, something needs to be done, and the other 4% are like, yeah, you're right. And then you have close to that magic 10% number where you can create institutional change, and the rest of the people just kind of like, okay, I'll go along with this because I don't want to be branded, whatever name you want to, because that's the way things happen now, right? Like you're a racist, or you're a this phobe or that phobe or whatever, and nobody wants to be.
You're a fundamentalist.
Yeah, you're a bigot or whatever. Nobody wants to be branded by that stuff. So a lot of people just be quiet, and then the change takes place.
So what I hear you saying is a really small minority can effectively bring about change in institutions through this method. So instead of straight up Marxism in the classic sense, or if you want to say nuclear weapons pointed at each other, this is a different kind of warfare.
Yeah.
And it's actually, I think, been more effective, hasn't it? Maybe comment on that.
Definitely. And I think what we see is that this was taken up by a group of like-minded people in Germany that were called the Frankfurt School. And they actually get kicked out of Germany in the 30s, and eventually a lot of these folks find their way to Columbia University. And probably the biggest name of these guys was Herbert Marcuse. And they're the ones who came up with this idea of critical theory, it's called, which is the same idea that Gramsci espoused. And they said that most people are not active participants in these things, that most people don't think about these things like you and I are doing right now.
Right.
They just are receptors. And so if you could, again, infiltrate the media and infiltrate the academic world and all these things, that most people, if you just keep hitting them with this stuff, eventually they'll say, like, yeah, okay.
It sort of sinks in by osmosis.
I agree, yeah. And then that's how, again, you get this change that you want. And so it's like you said, it's a tactical approach, and it's more subversive. But eventually, like Gramsci said, eventually you'll convince enough of the people that the people will actually ask for the change, and they'll be the ones out making the transformation happen.
It's fascinating. So I would call this demonically brilliant.
Yes.
In terms of, because we've seen its success across our society in all these different spheres. Well, we're going to explore this some more with Josh Kline. We'll be right back after this message.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth for this exciting 4-part episode on worldview and influences in our modern culture. We're here with Josh Kline. Josh, we were talking about the morphing of Marxism. One comment I wanted to add, also in the 1960s, the Marxists didn't want to give up their Marxism, but when the horrors of the starvation of the people in the Ukraine and other aspects of Marxism came out of the Soviet Union, when they started discovering these things, it was so morally abhorrent to them, but they didn't want to give up their Marxism. So it morphed, and I think part of what we see in academia was attached to what Gramsci did earlier. They were still committed to the worldview. And so part of this is, you wanted to add a little bit more about Marcuse and what's called repressive tolerance. What in the world is that?
Yeah, he wrote a paper called Repressive Tolerance, and the whole idea is it's sort of like tolerance for me but not for thee. So we want to promote the idea of tolerance, and we want everybody to be acceptive of all views except for the views that we don't think are acceptable, right? And it sounds ridiculous, but he says this in the article, that that's what we want to do. We want to shut down anything that's against what we're saying, but then use our influence to promote the things that we're for under the guise of tolerance. Because who's not for tolerance?
Yes.
Who's not for letting everybody have a voice? Who's not for these ideas that we all kind of hold sacrosanct, but just not the people who we disagree with? And I think too, like, goes back to what we said about ideas, that these ideas took hold in the universities, and it takes a while for these to filter down to the common person, but
that's right.
It's there, and you see all these. There were these groups like Students for Democratic Society in the '60s, and you can play like 3 degrees of connection between a lot of the even well-known people today. Like the main translator of Gramsci's work was Pete Buttigieg's father, who was a professor at Notre Dame, right? So there's a lot of interconnections between these people who were these kind of radicals in the 60s who are now in positions of great influence, and they're aware of all of this stuff, even though the common person on the street might not be.
Yes.
They're aware of it.
Yes.
And so I think we talked about this before, that the average person thinks, well, of course, we should be tolerant, and we want love over hate and all these things that sound good.
Yes.
And we would all agree, but they're meant with a different end goal in mind, and I think we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, let me comment on that a little bit, because this is what I always say about these things. We formally agree, but as soon as we explore the underlying foundations of what you mean, we disagree.
Right.
So you say Black Lives Matter, we agree. Marxist construct under it, which undergirds the idea, we disagree completely. Right. So we only agree at the formal level.
Right.
But that formal agreement is what catches the sincere person who cares about their fellow man.
Right.
And then, I dare say, dupes them. Now, we're saying that not to condemn people, but to help them to see,
right,
not to buy into these ideas because they subvert the truth.
Yes.
You want the gospel to, you want to know Jesus to express your concern for your fellow man. That's how you do it, right? Okay, now, we got to go to another big category. We're talking about Marxism a lot, cultural Marxism, all of that kind of stuff. Let's talk about postmodernism, because this is another set of ideas and worldview structure that has integrated with it and has wreaked havoc culturally. Define that and discuss it for me, please.
Postmodernism is characterized by a broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism. And a lot of this stuff came out of the reaction from World War I and World War II, which was modernist thought. And so the idea of postmodernism is sort of like you can create your own meaning, and in creating your own meaning, you determine the reality that you live in, right? And
yes.
So logic and all, like, truth and all these things that we're talking about, these are constructs of this modern Western way of thinking. But that doesn't necessarily hold true for everyone, which, again, it's self-defeating, right? Is postmodernism true, or is,
right.
You can't get away from it.
And you have to reason to make a postmodern argument.
But it ultimately is that reality is what I deem it. And I think that's why the emphasis on language is so important. Because
yes.
if you change the meaning of a word, then in the postmodern mind, you've changed reality. And so, again, we oftentimes, when you have conversations with people about these things, you're using the same language, but you're not meaning the same thing.
In other words, you agree formally, but everything else is a disagreement.
Like what you just said, yes.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, that's a tool that's been used to advance this in the Gramscian way, to advance this, to make inroads into institutions, just by changing the language and saying, well, this is my truth, and you can have your truth, and we all have our own truth, but there is no such thing as truth.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So okay. So here's a couple things. So when you and I come along and say these truth claims are irreconcilable, like Marxism, cultural Marxism, and Christianity, these are irreconcilable truth claims.
Right.
The postmodernist would say no, I can hold to these views, you hold to them, and they're equally valid, or along those lines, right? So the human mind, if I hear you right, generates reality.
Right.
Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah.
Now, who generates reality in reality?
God.
So, again, we're talking about religious interpretation.
Right.
What do we become in postmodernism? We become gods ourselves.
Exactly.
Because we're generating reality.
Right.
Genesis 1.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a remarkable thing. I mean, it's terrible, but it's remarkable in its scope.
And it goes back to the religious, like all of this stuff is very religious in nature.
It really is. So tell us real quick about this. Reason is a white male Eurocentric construct. We got about a minute just to talk about that because it fits right into postmodernism. What is that?
Right. Well, again, you can say these things, right? But I think that at the core, no one really holds to these beliefs. Like like, would you want your doctor who's operating on you to be postmodern? You know, and just say like, well, reality is whatever I deem it to be, and so,
I'll just stick my scalpel here.
Yeah, like I can do whatever I want. Or do you want your bank statement to be postmodern? When you look at your bank account and things like we don't want that, but we want it in culture, we want it in religion, we want it in the things that we want it to be our way. Like you said, it all comes back to I don't want to submit to God's reality. I want to be able to create reality in my own image. Create
my own, yes. And so this reason being, I mean, think about how insulting this is to the ancients like the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Sumerians and the Israelites and all these people who are not white, who wrote and reasoned in the past, first of all. So the whole idea that reason is just a Western European idea is just foolish nonsense.
Right.
But the other idea here of us generating reality, I'm really intrigued by it because the promise of Satan is that you will be like God, right? Your eyes will be open. And here we are again, we're back to that rebellion against the Creator and religious connotation to all of it.
Yeah.
Well, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be right back.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. I'm here with my friend Joshua Kline, and we're talking about worldview influences, structures that are influencing our society. We've been talking about postmodernism, but now we're going to go back to Marcuse a little bit, not him per se, but the idea of critical theory, because this is a big component of all of this. This comes out of classical Marxism, but as we mentioned, it's morphed.
Right.
And it's been expanded. So let's explain critical theory a little bit more to the audience.
Okay, the great source, there's an apologist named Neil Shenvi, that's where I'm pulling this from, but he talks about 4 premises of critical theory. And so premise number 1, human relationships should be fundamentally understood in terms of power dynamics, which differentiates groups into oppressors and oppressed. So that goes back to that dialectic of Marxism.
So let's pause for just a quick second. So the central component of my relationship with my wife is power dynamics.
Yes.
That's the idea.
And all interactions.
All human interactions.
Somebody's being oppressed by someone else.
By someone else. And probably in the classical model, I'm the oppressor.
Yes,
right. Okay.
yes.
Go ahead. But no, we're laughing, but this is serious.
Yes,
this is exactly what the thought is. Okay, go ahead.
Number 2, our identity as individuals is inseparable from our group identity, especially as oppressor and or oppressed with respect to a particular identity marker. So it's this same thing that we read in the manifesto. It's this move away from individuality into the group. So it's not that, I care about Henry Smith as an individual. I want to categorize you by what groups you're a part of. Okay. And I just see you as part of the group.
And so in this case, I use the marriage thing as a thing. I'm a male. And so that's part of my identity as oppressing my wife in the context of marriage and a power dynamic.
Right.
You might say it that way.
Yes, yes.
And then because I'm white, there's another component to that as well. But that's how this works.
Right.
Got it.
Premise 3, all oppressed groups find their fundamental unity in their common experience of oppression. And so that's why I think it's interesting when you look at, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, this concept of intersectionalism. So you just find what oppressed groups you're in, and then you just kind of meet at the intersection of your oppression with other like oppressed people, and that's where you find your solidarity, right?
Okay.
And so again, it's not about you as an individual, it's just like what kind of boxes you can check as being oppressed, and then the more boxes, the more solidarity you have with more people.
With more people. Okay, so going back to my analogy with my poor wife, she's oppressed, and I'm a male, and she's a female, so her identity primarily is as an oppressed female,
right,
if there's such a thing anymore, but we'll just say that there's female, right?
Yep.
So that is the central identity of her as a person. That's how this would play itself out,
Yes.
in a sense.
Right.
Okay, now number 4.
And then finally, the fundamental human project is liberation from all forms of oppression. Consequently, the fundamental virtue is standing in solidarity against the oppressor.
Okay.
So that's the end goal. We want to eliminate all this oppression.
Okay. And so in our marriage analogy, really getting rid of marriage would be the way to do that, because
Sure.
that's
Because
an
you're
oppressive dynamic.
locked into this monogamous relationship, and you want to be able to be free of all restraints to just do whatever your heart desires.
Right.
And not even, remember, like Engels said, not even have to take care of your kids. The community will take care of your kids, and you can just do whatever you want.
And you can have complete freedom.
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about this quote from Carl Trueman. Now, I had Dr. Trueman in church history at Westminster Seminary before he left and went to Grove City College just for one class, but he gives this critique about critical theory. He uses this quote, the dialectical destabilization of morality. Now, we talked about the dialectic in the classic Marx sense, but here it's been expanded, as we talked about in critical theory, to all these different categories. The destabilization of morality, isn't that the goal of Marx?
Yes. See, you can see it's the same thing. It's from the same root,
Yes.
but it's now you're just seeing it, the different branches of it. So the end goal is the same.
Yeah.
It's the Gramsci. We've changed the approach.
Yeah, the mechanisms have changed. We're not Cold War, but now we're institutions. We get into the institutions, we change them, transform them, and then we want to remake the culture.
And so
from
part,
that.
like one group that you could be in would be, like a dominant group would be someone who espouses Judeo-Christian beliefs in our particular country. Now that wouldn't transfer over if you were in Saudi Arabia or something like that.
Right.
You would be in the oppressed category, but here in the West, you're the oppressor. And so how dare you foist your moral standards and values on me? And then, why the bigoted, judgmental attitude that you have based on just the way that you see it?
Yeah.
I have my own reality and my own values, and there's the dialectic again. You're the oppressor and the oppressed.
So the primary problem with the individual who's in the oppressor category or the oppressed category is not sin.
No.
It's these cultural dynamics that have unfolded over the course of history.
Right.
In a way, you and I are in that structure. We're just naturally oppressors,
Yeah.
just by virtue of being born into the system,
Yes.
where our immutable attributes are what they are, and we become that.
Right.
So in effect, it doesn't matter what we do, we're guilty.
Yeah, because that undercuts the idea of a meritocracy. It's not that you're here because you somehow have qualifications and have earned it.
Right, or worked hard,
Yeah,
or
I mean,
whatever. Right.
you're born with the silver spoon, and now you're
Yeah.
just reaping the benefits at the
Yeah.
expense of everyone who's been in these oppressed groups that have allowed you to attain the position that you have today.
So there's a sort of so there's an imputed guilt.
Yes.
That's a theological thing. Now we have that in Christianity, it comes from Adam. Okay, we have our own guilt, but we can't get into the details of that. But again, here we have a doctrine of sin. That's at the central part of this critical theory.
Right.
Religious nature of that. So,
And it goes back to the hegemony of Gramsci, right? So
Yes.
you're essentially in a sinful position just by nature of birth, which is the kind of original sin of Marxism. You're born into the oppressor class, right?
Yes. Okay. Well, Josh, we've gone through 3 episodes, believe it or not, and we got 1 more to go. So we are going to pick up on this thought. We have this incredible religious quote about critical theory that we're going to share in our next episode. You're going to share it,
Okay.
and then we're going to wrap it up. All right. Well, friends, thank you for joining us. We hope you've been tracking with us. We think this is really important for us to understand the signs of the times, to critique them, to understand that the gospel is the solution to these worldview structures that are destroying our culture, destroying relationships between people, and in some places infiltrating the church. We pray that you will have wisdom in regard to these things. And please join us again for our fourth and last episode on this subject of Digging for Truth.